Hello and welcome back to the Developing Solutions with Sitecore Print Experience Manager video training series. In this video, we'll be continuing some of the advanced PXM development concepts. So this is part 2 of our workflow examples. On part 1, we focused on simple use cases, which was either updating and sending a PDF to be generated based upon a new Sitecore content item that was created, or creating a new PXM project pointing it to that new Sitecore content item that was created. In our case here, we're going to focus on a really advanced use case, and we're going to take that Launch Sitecore book PXM project that we were working with earlier, and instead of using repeaters to iterate through content and build that document out on the fly and send that to InDesign server, we're going to reference those same repeaters in our code and build out a very large PXM project. And the advantage to this over the traditional repeater methodology is the nice thing about repeaters is that you don't have a very large Sitecore project, and it can do some very complex things and build out a lot of stuff and send that to InDesign client. The disadvantage is that any changes that you might make, you're really only making to the document itself, and you can do that and save that offline. But if you do want to make changes and have those persist into Sitecore, not just the underlying content, but the actual design itself, well, then you need to have that as an item in the PXM project so that you can save to that item and load from that item on a regular basis. And so what we're going to do is basically end up with the same output as far as the designer opening that in InDesign is concerned. It's just what you do with that output after the fact. So in our case here, it allows you to make granular changes, push that back to Sitecore. And in our earlier examples, those granular changes, you're really limited. It's sort of a read-only thing that you're working with in InDesign, and you can take that and work with that offline, but it doesn't give you the same flexibility. So both approaches are valid. It's just, one is a bit more common than the other, and it really depends upon your need and use of that content in InDesign going forward, whether it's just small changes that you can simply take and run with, or whether it's a much larger project that you want to push those changes back to Sitecore. So first things first, since we're going to be doing some similar steps to what we had in the Launch Sitecore article workflow, I'm actually just going to make a copy of that, and we're going to call this the Build PXM project workflow. Now, one of the things that, of course, everybody knows when you're working with workflows in Sitecore is that all of the items and references in that workflow are not relative. They're actually absolute, and they are pointing to that Launch Sitecore workflow. So we need to go through one at a time and basically update all these references so that instead of pointing to the Launch Sitecore workflow that we just copied from, we're going to be pointing to the current workflow that we're in, which is that Build PXM project workflow. So we need to do that for a number of steps here. So we'll go do that. And then when we're done, we'll go and make a few other changes. We're also going to delete our create PDF step here. And we'll clear out the contents of that awaiting approval step. So within this here, we'll edit our rule, and we're going to remove these steps. And then next, we're going to go to Visual Studio, and we're going to create some additional workflow tasks that are going to do that project building. So back in Visual Studio here, I'm going to do as I've done before. I'm going to create a new item, again, under Sitecore with Sitecore Rocks. I'm going to say pick a new rule action, and I'm going to call that Build PXM Project Repeaters. And of course, it's created that item in Sitecore for me. Now, once again, and a lot of this code is actually based upon that simple build PXM project. The only difference is we're going to be looking for repeaters in our project, and we're going to be grabbing variables from those repeaters. So we're going to use the same XPath, we're going to use the same data reference swapping essentially, but instead of doing that on the fly, we're actually going to go and create new Sitecore items underneath that. And so there's a lot going on here. So first off, I'm going to put in a bunch of code here under my main statement. And so what this is doing is basically allowing me to get the PXM project. And what we're doing here is we're going to put the workflow on the PXM project itself. And we're going to accomplish that by using a branch template. Now, what we're going to have in our workflow command is picking an existing document in a project. And the reason why we haven't gone up to the project at its top level is we're creating a new project. That's kind of what we're working with. And so we need to pick an item that's below the project, but above the pages, because we're going to be working with and creating a whole bunch of new pages. And document seems like a good place to do that. And so we're basically taking a document from an existing project, and that's our parameter. Now, first off, we're going to find a repeater and build child items. And what I have on this repeater and what I've added to the repeater item as parameters is something called build level. And the thing is about our repeaters is that you need to have some control over how these repeaters will be exploded out. And I'll give you a good example. We need to first build out all of our chapters, and then within each chapter, we're going to have a repeater going through the articles. And so we can't do an XPath query because it'll return certain articles coming from the first chapter first. We need to be able to specify and give some granularity to say, okay, as we're building out these repeaters, here's the order that I need to do them in. Part of my code is a little bit ugly. This could have been made to have been more recursive. But the problem with something that's recursive is that you need to have some very expensive XPath queries, and you're basically searching for every single item underneath a PXM project. And the way I've done it is a bit of a hybrid. Instead of doing something that iterates nicely and allows you to just simply keep repeating through a structure, I've done a bit of a hybrid. And so I have this going through one level first, building out or exploding, I kind of call it, or unpacking those repeaters, and then I'm unpacking all the repeaters within that chapter to build out all the articles. But it's a little bit faster because instead of using an XPath query that gives me all those repeaters in the context, I now can start at a much lower place in that content tree, and I'm working with less items within that query. So it's a bit faster for execution. And this is important because this workflow is building out a very, very large content tree, and there's a lot of content items, sub-content items, renderers, repeaters, you're updating values. There's a lot of stuff going on. And so this is kind of going through that. So my first function here, my find repeater and build child items, I'll put that in, and we'll sort of go through as I copy and paste this stuff from my project. We'll go through what I've built out. Okay, so first thing I'm calling here is find repeater and build child items. So I'm essentially using a little bit of XPath to say, okay, within my document, go and find my current item where my template key is XML repeat. Template key works off lowercase, so that's great, and contains build level and that parameter. And so this is basically finding me items that have that parameter of build level 1. And then I'm going through that and I'm finding the child data keys. And so this is basically something within the repeaters that we use for those very complex iterative structures. And so, for example, in my as I'm iterating through my chapters, my child data key is chapter singular. And then as I'm iterating through a chapter singular, it will set the child data key of article. And so that allows you to constantly move down that chain. And so in our case here, what we're doing is we're finding those references. I'm setting a sort order to the end because as I build out this content and I'm making copies of existing items, I want them to stack to the end. So I'm starting with a very high sort order and I'm incrementing that. And then as I go through and if I have hit an XML repeater underneath my main repeater that I'm working with, then I will go through build child items and set this to 2. So I've hard coded this, and what this allows me to do is as I'm further down a tree, this is a much smaller query. If this was a true recursive function, I would need it to work with the entire PXM project, and that can get very large. And so I've done a bit of a hybrid here. Unfortunately, my build child items, there's a lot of repeated code, but the advantage is the performance of this, because I've sort of intentionally made it work with my 2-level project. This is a bit faster from a performance perspective. And so that's what I'm doing. And then as I build out those child items, I'm calling my update snippets. And this is very similar to what we did with our simpler project. We're finding that snippet, we're looking for the data key, and we're updating references in that snippet to some content. Now in this case here, instead of the content being sort of what's initiating this workflow and initiating this build process, it's actually a new PXM project that I'm creating that initializes this. So I've built this code. Once again, we need to compile. We need to go back to that item here that was created for us in Sitecore Rocks. And then the last step is to create a new branch template and apply this workflow to that new branch template that's going to be used in PXM. And then we can see this in action. So again, we're back here in Sitecore, and I've added the text here. And so we pick an existing document in an existing PXM project, and that will be passing to the variable PXM doc ID. So we're going to save that. And once again, we will move this item to our definitions and elements and dynamic workflow. And then at that point, we can use that in our workflows. So definitions, elements, dynamic workflow, and we can move that. And now if we go back to our workflow that we created, our build PXM project workflow, we can add a new rule action, which is our build out this PXM project based upon an existing document as a template. So I'm going to go to my Launch Sitecore book and pick that document in the Launch Sitecore book. And the reason I've picked document is because I need something that's underneath a project, because we're creating a new project. That's what's kicking off this workflow. But I need it to be above the pages because we're going to be building out lots of pages. So it has to be somewhere in between. So I've picked document and say OK. And then last step is to take this workflow and apply that to a new branch template. And so the nice thing about PXM is that at a number of places within project and document and page creation, you can use branch templates. And this includes being called in the Print Studio connector. So if I go to my templates and branches and Print Studio templates, I have Print Studio project. I'm going to make a duplicate of this and call this Launch Sitecore book project. And everything will be exactly the same. The only difference is by going to my PXM project item, I'm going to go down to my workflow and I'm going to pick my build PXM project workflow, and this will put me into that draft state. And so now when I create a new PXM project, I will have the option to pick Launch Sitecore Book. And then when I create that, it will automatically put me into this workflow, and it will automatically kick off those workflow steps when I choose to build that. So last step, as always, make sure your code is compiled. Make sure that we've published all of these out to the web databases. So that's our new workflow rule action, our new workflow itself, and of course, our new branch template. Our next step is to actually go back to our existing Launch Sitecore Book project. And so while this uses repeaters to build out content dynamically and send it to InDesign, we're going to be using this within our workflow to build out the actual full content underneath that. Now, a couple things here. We've added this parameter of build level. And so what we're going to do here is build everything here in this repeater first. Now, the reason why we don't just iterate through every repeater is because we have a number of repeaters here that are within pages. So for example, we have a authors page and we iterate through authors as little elements on that page. And we want to keep this repeater as a repeater because it's building out stuff on the page. The repeaters that we want to sort of unpack or explode out are actually the ones that create a number of pages within or underneath that repeater. So in this case here, we're iterating through chapters, and each chapter is going to build out 4 pages, an optional blank page, a left and a right, and then the chapter start page. And then it's going to start building out the articles. And then within that article, I want to unpack these second. So that's why I'm adding build level 2 here. And so this gives me a little bit of control within that. And then similarly, by having it within my code that as soon as this is hit underneath that, I'm just going to work with the content underneath this. It means that I'm not having to crawl the entire rest of the tree looking for a build level 2. And so that's why I don't have a really, in the code, I don't have it fully recursive. I'm basically just calling this in levels manually. It gives me a bit more control, and it's a lot faster performance-wise. And so those are those 2 build levels. And so again, I'm going to publish this out. In our case here, it's probably unnecessary because we're working with the master database calling from the InDesign connector. We're usually only working with the web database when we're being called from the production site. But it's a good practice or a good habit to get into to publish on a regular basis. So now that we're back here to the InDesign connector, I'm going to create a new Print Studio project. Call it Launch Sitecore Book Test. And I'm going to use my Launch Sitecore Book project as my branch. And so I have that there, and you can see here that it is empty. I have nothing under documents. But if I go to my workbox, I can refresh my build PXM project workflow, and I can see that I have my Launch Sitecore Book Test here, and I can submit that. And that's going to move me from my draft state to my awaiting approval state. And then at that point, now I can see my workflow state here that has my create PXM project, and I can say okay to that. And what this is going to do now is it's talked to Sitecore, it's kicked off that workflow step, and it's going through and it's iterating through all that content, and it's created all that. So if I now go to my libraries here and refresh this, I can see that I have all of this built out, a whole number of pages, and then within a chapter it's built out all those items for each chapter. And then within a chapter, it's built out all my items for each and every article. And I can go and drag and drop this over, and I can load this, and everything that we're seeing here in this PXM project is identical to using the repeater methodology. But in this case here, it has built out Sitecore content items for each and every one of these articles. And that's the big difference, is now I can work with each of these individually, and I can go into each one of these individually, and I can save these changes. If I go down to this Launch Sitecore page, or if I go down to this Launch Sitecore page, I know exactly what I'm working with, and I can work with the content within that. And so that's The big difference between that repeater methodology, which builds all this on the fly and sends it to InDesign Server, versus workflow, which builds it in the PXM project, which I can then open in that InDesign client.